We are in the series Journey to the Cross, where we are looking at the events of the last 24 hours of the life of Jesus before he died on the cross. And this morning we find ourselves where he is standing before the Roman governor of Judea, Pilate, a man who's been entrusted with a little bit of authority, and where Pilate sentences him to death on a cross. Just recently, it was on the news that the president of Venezuela, a country that's in turmoil because this president and another man who the people claim is their true president are battling each other, and the country's really in turmoil. And on the news, they said that international aid was being blocked, that the president was refusing supplies and food to come into his country to help his people. An abuse of power, a misuse of power. He's not the only one. The president of Syria, as you probably well know, did something similar. In fact, he actually used some of his own people as human shields. You think of that, children used as human shields, the abuse of power. And it's not just something that's new in our day. It goes back to the fall, and we just look back at people with power who misuse it. And in the time of Jesus, as he's standing before Pilate, in the Roman Empire, there was the misuse of power. It was about power and force and wealth and status. It's about those who are in power, keeping their power, looking out only for themselves. In fact, if you look at the 70 or so emperors of the Roman Empire, only about 25% of them died of natural causes. The other 75% either died in battle or were assassinated, just trying to keep their power. And as we come to this portion of Scripture this morning, Mark wants us to see a king, but he wants us to see what kind of king he is. This morning we're going to look at Jesus the King, and the King who ended up on a cross. And Mark wants us to see what kind of king he is, because he knows when we understand that, it changes our lives. We're not the same. So I'm going to ask you if you would turn to Mark chapter 15, and we're going to work through this text. And I'm going to ask you to behold this morning the King that went to the cross for you. Mark records these words in verse 1. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. So first thing in the morning, it was probably about 6 a.m., just after sunrise, the Jewish leaders, this large group of men, they're on Pilate's doorstep with Jesus. And today, we're going to see Pilate sentencing Jesus. But if you recall, there were 6 phases to this trial. From 12 o'clock or so midnight on Thursday night when Jesus is arrested, until he's on a Roman cross at 9 a.m. or so Friday morning, through the night and early morning, he experiences 6 different trials. First, if you recall, he went to the Jewish ex-high priest, Annas, and Annas interrogates him, but can't get anything to stick. So then he is brought to Caiaphas, the current high priest, and we talked about that last week, where Jesus had this unjust trial in the middle of the night, and he was condemned by the Jewish leaders to death. And then first thing, on Friday morning at sunrise, they gather in the temple, in a chamber in the temple, to issue the sentence, to give it some sort of legality, appearance of legality. But the Jewish leaders cannot execute Jesus. They need the Romans to actually formally make the sentence. And so they bring him to Pilate, who is the governor of Judea, on the far eastern edge of the Roman Empire. Pilate really doesn't want to deal with this king, this would-be king, and he finds a way out, and he sends him to Herod Antipas, and Jesus appears before Herod Antipas just across town in Jerusalem. But then he comes back to Pilate, a second time. And Mark records for us here phase 1 and phase 3 of this particular trial. Pilate, just before we begin, he says, or we are told through the ancient writers Josephus and Philo, that he was a corrupt man, a cruel man, a vindictive man, a man who just thirsted for power. And so there is Jesus the King standing before Pilate. He's on the far eastern edge of the Roman Empire. Nobody wanted to be there. He didn't want to be in that place. He wanted to be closer to Rome. He wanted to work his way up the ladder, but he's stuck here with this would-be king. So let's pick up the narrative in verse 2. Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, Pilate's role is to keep the peace in this part of the empire and to make sure the taxes are collected and sent to Rome. So he's going to do everything he can to keep peace between the Romans and the Greeks and the Jews in this part of the empire. And so he asks Jesus if he's a king, because king is a political term. And his job was to make sure that nobody tried to overthrow Rome, that there was no rebel that would lead an insurrection. So that's why he asked Jesus if he is the king, because there really were two boxes that he could check, and he's trying to figure out what box it is. This box here, if I check this box, if you really are a king, if you're leading people to overthrow the Emperor Tiberius, then I will sentence you to death on a cross. You will be executed. But if you're not a king, I will check this box over here, and you can go on your merry way. Either way, I've got to check a box. And it's interesting, in the Greek in the Greek language, it comes across this way. The personal pronoun you is placed at the beginning of the sentence, and that word order indicates emphasis. So really, Pilate is asking the question, which box do I check? But he's also mocking Jesus at the same time. It literally in the Greek reads, "You, the king of the Jews? You really are their king?" Now, Jesus just hours before had been in a fight, but he didn't fight back. And so before Pilate is this man with spit in his hair, dried spit. He's probably bruised and swollen, and his clothes are probably torn. And Pilate's like, really? He's no friend of the Jews. Pilate was no friend of the Jews. And he's like, really, this is the best you've got to be a king? This is the guy that's going to overthrow Tiberius, the emperor? Are you kidding me? Jesus, look how he responds. You have said so. Why didn't Jesus just say, yes, I'm the king? Because as John records for us, Jesus was a king, but his kingdom was not of this world. In other words, Jesus was saying, you have said so. Pilate, yes, I am a king, but I'm not the kind of king that you think. So you can't really check this box or that box when it comes to my identity. I'm a king, but not like the kings that you conceive of. So Pilate is in a quandary. What do I do with this man? Pilate is leaning to checking the box that this guy is not a king. He's harmless. Go on your way. But then the chief priests interrupt. Verse 3 and 4. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of. What were the accusations against Jesus? Well, Luke tells us that they were saying, he's subverting our nation. He's ruining our people. He's corrupting our people. He calls for people to refuse to pay taxes to the emperor. He's claiming to be a king. Don't let him sway you, Pilate. He swayed the people, but he's a deceiver. He's a liar. You need to check this box. And so Pilate is there with Jesus, wanting him to clarify for him. Are you really a king? Tell me what box to check. Verse 5. But Jesus still made no reply, And Pilate was amazed. Pilate is looking at a man and he's wondering, why won't he say he isn't a king? Because Pilate has been on the battlefield. Pilate has been a Roman soldier. He knows how it works. In a kingdom of power, you worked your way up and you'd do anything to keep your power. And if you found yourself powerless, you'd beg and plead for the person in power to give you some mercy. Pilate has seen many men before him begging him that they would not be executed. And if they were, begging him that they wouldn't be executed by the way of a cross. It was too slow, something. And here's a man before him who's not begging and asking and protesting and saying, set me free, let me go. And Pilate, Mark records for us, is amazed. He's never seen anyone like Jesus. Now, it was a custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. John tells us that it was Pilate actually instigated this idea of releasing Jesus, because every Passover festival, they were just about to celebrate, or in the midst of celebrating the Passover, a sign of goodwill from the Romans to the Jews was to release one of their own criminals. We do this sometimes in our world still today, where someone is released, a prisoner is released from one country, working with the other country. And so as a sign of goodwill, Pilate is like, well, do you want me to release Jesus to you? But the Jewish leaders hated Jesus so much, they stir up the crowd. They say, we want the guy named Barabbas. And Barabbas was the insurrectionist. He's part of a rebellion against Can we try this, Gordon? I'm trying to think of where I was. Jewish leaders hated Rome, and Rome hated the Jews. Pilate hates the Jews. He wants to free Jesus, not simply because he thinks Jesus has committed no crime, but because he doesn't want the Jewish leaders to tell him what to do. He's all about resisting them. He always wanted to remind them that Rome was in power. They were subjects of Rome. They really didn't have any power. So he wants to release Jesus, but the Jewish leaders stir up the crowd to release Barabbas, the insurrectionist, instead. And again, yes, Barabbas was someone like, if you can recall, those who were behind 9/11 that had blood on their hands. This is who the crowd called for. Give us back our Jewish friend Barabbas instead. Mark records then what happens next. What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews? Pilate asked them. Crucify him, they shouted. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. If Pilate is the one with more power than the Jewish leaders, why didn't he simply let Jesus go? It was because the Jews had outmaneuvered him. John tells us a little bit about that in his gospel. In John 19, we read, from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king
opposes Caesar. We have no king but Caesar, the chief priest answered. In other words, Pilate, checkmate, we've got you. He's a king. You need to check this box. And Pilate has to bow to these Jewish leaders and check that box. Because we know from history, 3 major incidents had happened between Pilate and the Jewish leaders. In fact, Pilate was the guy who, when there was a fly in the room, would take a sledgehammer to kill the fly. And he came down hard on the Jews. And so 3 times there was an incident where it was so bad that the Jewish people sent people all the way from the corner of this empire to Rome to complain to Emperor Tiberius. And Pilate had 3 strikes against him, one more, and he knew not only would he be out of power, but he would probably be executed as well. Again, it was a ruthless empire. Life was cheap. So to save his own skin, he releases Barabbas to them. Then he has Jesus flogged, and John tells us after the flogging that he actually again goes out and says, look at this pitiful little person here. He's harmless. But still they shouted, crucify him. Before we continue, I want to pause for a moment and just notice Mark's emphasis. Mark is not wanting us to see this king and to focus on his physical punishment. He simply says Jesus was flogged and crucified, sent to be crucified. Crucifixion, we know, was a gruesome way to die. You would hang on a Roman cross and slowly asphyxiate on the cross. Flogging was very gruesome as well. We know from history that people actually died during a flogging. A flogging was where 2 lictors, Roman officials, would have a victim tied to either a wooden post or a metal stake. And there the victim was stripped naked and just tied to this post. The lictor would take a whip, a leather whip that had bone and stone and metal intertwined with it. And the lictor would then lash the victim, not just his back, but his torso and legs. And they did it in such a way, this up and down movement, this side to side, so as to really make deep lacerations, so that the victim really felt pain. And again, many, or more than one, bled to death just from a loss of blood. And Mark just matter-of-factly says he was flogged and then sentenced to be crucified. Mark doesn't really want us to focus on his physical pain. He doesn't want us to focus so much on the spiritual pain. John does that for us when he talks about Jesus and his last words on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? And the 7 last sayings of Jesus. John wants us to see the spiritual pain between God the Father and God the Son. But Mark, he wants us to see the emotional pain, the humiliation, the mockery of the king. So Mark writes, the soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. Mark says after he is sentenced, he's brought to the praetorium, the residence of Pilate, where Pilate lives when he's in town in Jerusalem. And there the whole company. Now, Pilate has about 3,000 men under his control. But in the Greek, it's probably about 600 or so that are there. And they join in on a game where they're going to play with a would-be king. And they put a purple robe on him. In the Roman Empire, it was all about power. For you to have meaning in your life, you had to try to climb to power. If you did, like the emperor and about 600 of his senators, those that worked with him, you got to wear purple. You got a purple stripe on your toga. and you got to sit in the highest places in any social function. And you were somebody. You were not part of the nobodies. And so they take a robe, a purple robe, and place it on him. You are somebody. And they twist together a crown of thorns and they put it on him, probably pressing it right into his head. Could you imagine putting a robe on a beaten, bloody body of a man who's half dead because he's just been flogged? But that's not enough. Mark continues. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews." Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. Here's the king being spit upon, being beaten, and being mocked. And that's what Mark wants us to see. What does he want us to see? Why did the soldiers mock Jesus? Did Pilate issue a command? Hey, before you execute him, make sure you humiliate this man? Probably not. They probably mocked him because they couldn't fathom a king who would take the posture of a servant. All they'd known were kings that used their power for their own ends. They couldn't fathom a true king that would willingly lay down his life for other people. A king was to defeat his enemies and conquer his enemies and gloat over his enemies. They couldn't fathom a king who would die for his enemies. Mark wants us to see the true identity of the one with power, with all the power, being mocked and ridiculed and beaten. The team from Zambia has returned, as you know, and I asked one of the people on the team if they still had the custom on the island of Zambia, or island of Amabala, this island of about 8,000 people, if when you came into the presence of the chief, if you had to get on your knees and kind of like bow and clap 3 times, and that still happens. And I remember doing that. And can you imagine? Here's a chief on an island of about 8,000 people. He's got a little bit of power, and you come into his presence, and you get on your knees and you clap 3 times. I never did figure out or understand or ask why it's 3 times. So maybe somebody knows. But you get on your knees before him, and you clap. If you or I were to come into the presence of the Queen of England, the longest reigning queen in the history of the British Empire, there's a certain protocol for her. You don't reach out your hand to shake her hand, you don't touch her, you don't take that initiative, you don't turn your back on her. There's a certain protocol. Someone will interrupt you before you get the queen and says, here's what you have to do and here's what you don't do. And Mark wants us to see a king, and he's being bowed before. But it's in humiliation. It's mockery. Because Mark knows when you see who this king is, it changes your life. That this is a king who had all the power, but he laid it down and willingly went to a cross in our place. And when we understand that truth, it changes us from the inside out. It changes our view of God. That not only is he the God who is majestic and has all power, who created all things, that he's a great God, but we begin to see that he's also a good God, a God of love and grace and mercy. And it changes our identity as well, how we see ourselves. That we're always not now striving to try to get him to like us, but he loves us. And we're reminded of that time after time, week after week, as we think of the one who died on the cross for us, that we are his beloved, that he is for us, he is with us, he wants the best for us. It changes how we see ourselves, and then it changes how we live our lives. We don't simply come to church on Sunday and punch in and punch out, but we come to church on Sunday to worship him, to bow before him in awe and gratitude, not only for who he is, but for what he has done. And we not only try to reach out to people that don't know Jesus, but we want to make sure that we have people that know Jesus in our lives, because the last thing we want is to wander from Jesus, from the King. We don't want to be deceived into thinking that this life is all about me. It's all about acquiring. It's all about achieving. It's all about me working my way up so people think how great I am. But we realize it's all about the King. It's all about Jesus. And so I want people in my life to remind me of that, to make sure I don't stray from him. That's the kind of King that he is. When I was growing up as a boy, we used to have in our elementary school an assembly once a year from time to time. And I was asked to speak at this assembly a number of times. And so as I was preparing this passage this week to speak, a certain speech I gave came to mind. So my first speech when I was I think it was in kindergarten or grade 1, was on Bobby Hall, the Golden Jet. Does anybody remember that hockey player? Right? Then my second speech was on the Bumblebee. For the life of me, I have no idea why, but I stood up there and I was singing the wonders of the Bumblebee. And then my other speech, when I was 11 years old, was on citizenship, on being a good citizen. And 11-year-old boy, I had God on my mind, but also hockey. And so I opened my speech this way. I said, imagine that you are on a breakaway, and the other team has pulled their goalie. It's the last game of the season. And in front of you is an empty net. And if you shoot the puck in the net, you will set an all-time scoring record. But beside you is a player who has never scored a goal in their entire career, and it's his last game as well. And if he shoots the puck in the net, if you pass it to him, it will be his one and only goal. Do you shoot the puck, or do you pass it? Today, I want to talk to you about being a good citizen. As we journey through life, we'll probably meet one or two good citizens, and hopefully you're a good citizen, you're passing the puck. And someone passes you the puck and you high-five them, or you hug them, or you send a thank you letter and you say, thanks so much. But there is only one King who laid down his life for you in your place. It's the only solution to the sin and death problem that we all have. And when you understand who he is, you worship. And you worship him alone. I'm going to ask you to stand with me as we pray. Let's pray together. God of ages, you did step down from glory to wear our sin and to bear our shame. On the cross, you gave your life for us. Father, this morning, stir in our hearts once again awe and gratitude. Lord God, you alone are worthy of our praise. Today we enter into your courts with thanksgiving. Lord, today we praise you from the rising of the sun to the going down of the same. Lord, you alone are worthy of our praise. Amen. I'm going to ask you now, as the worship team leads us, to praise the one who gave himself for you. If you feel like raising your hands or closing your eyes, please do.